Rachael Bedard, our special guest.
Hi.
How wonderful to see you. So welcome to the Arch Network's essentially bi-monthly seminar series and works in progress. I think we'll wait just a couple minutes to see if a few more people join. We usually have somewhere between 15 and 25 people. And people often come in a little bit late, but I would love to just give them a couple more minutes just in case. And then as a reminder, this is recorded and we have it cataloged on our Small But Mighty website so that other people who were busy during this hour can take a look at it. And as a reminder, the Arch Network is an NIH, National Institute on Aging funded network that essentially focuses on creating the international collaborations needed to move the science around aging, serious illness, and criminal legal system involvement forward. We have a wide range of different speakers, everything from how to fill out in the special IRB forms around conducting research in prisons and jails to people who have themselves experienced aging and serious illness in the prison system, to people who study people experiencing serious illness and aging in the prison system, to people working with trying to take care of and protect the human rights and health of people aging and experiencing serious illness in the correctional system. And so with that, I see more people are joining, so I'm just going to take a couple more minutes. But I'll start introducing you to Rachael Bedard and also remind you that after this session, we will have a works in progress of one of our funded, one of our network faculty members. So stay afterwards for works in progress if you have the time. So Rachael Bedard is well known to me for many years. I feel proud to say that I brought her to Rikers for her first time ever when she was quite pregnant many years ago, when she was still a fellow, I think. Is that right, Rachael? Yeah, at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. So Rachael Bedard probably requires no introduction. Many of you likely know her, but she is a geriatrician and palliative care physician. For 5 years, she worked in the New York City jail system, where she was the first jail-based geriatrician in the US. While she was there, Dr. Bedard saw patients on Rikers Island. She started the system's Geriatrics and Complex Care Service, which was an interdisciplinary team that oversaw care, compassionate release efforts, and discharge planning for the 200 oldest and sickest people in the jail system at Rikers. Dr. Bedard is also a writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, most recently in the New Yorker, and many other publications. She's also a research fellow at Harvard's Institute to End Mass Incarceration. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 children. And I would also just say personally, Rachael Bedard is just a wonderful colleague, a close friend, and just an incredible all-around person who thinks deeply and strategically about what needs to happen differently for the most incarcerated generation. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Rachael, and we're absolutely thrilled that you could come and be here with us today.
Thank you so much, Bree. I should start. So I will say this, I think, many times in different ways through this talk, but my whole career is because of my relationship with Bree Williams. She was at UCSF. I mean, I was never at UCSF, but Bree became my research mentor during fellowship and helped me do a fellowship project looking at the number of people who are formally incarcerated in the geriatric population in the US. And she taught me everything that I know about compassionate release. And she was the person who encouraged me to take a job at Rikers when that seemed like a very risky proposition to my academic advisors at Mount Sinai. And Bree said, no, it's a good opportunity, you should do it. And she was right. So I'm thrilled to be here with Bree, with all of you, and I'm going to share my screen and hope that that works. Oh, shoot. Hold on. Something's happening. Oh my God, what? Hold on one second. Something has happened and it won't let me.
It'll work eventually.
Will it? Oh my goodness. What if I can't? Why isn't it
Does
doing
it say that, does it say you can't share the screen? Because I think Michelle made you a,
Yeah, it says that I can, and then it's telling me that I don't.
Yeah, all participants can share the screen, so
Okay,
the
hold on one second, everybody. I'm
Yeah.
really sorry about this.
while you're figuring it out. Is anybody new to these meetings? If so, can you like put your little hand up? Awesome. So you have all been in some of our meetings before. Oh, no, Lindsay and Erica. So Lindsay, why don't you introduce yourself, and then Erica, you can as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Yorman. I'm a geriatrician, and I recently started a position as Chief Geriatric Officer of San Diego County. And I have a colleague that is involved with justice, engaged health, and he's also very interested in this. So I'll be taking some notes for him. And I also hope to have some impact in this area. Can't wait to learn from all of you.
We're thrilled that you're here, Lindsay. And Lindsay is a great example of somebody who was in academic medicine for a long time and then had an opportunity in community health that was just unpassable. And so she went over there. It's going to do great things. We're super proud of her. And then Erica.
Hi, my name is Erica Morris. I'm a new program manager with Amend. I'm really interested to check these meetings out. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And we're hoping that this gets sorted out quickly. Anybody have any updates or things that they'd like to, any announcements they'd like to make or opportunities that they'd like to tell people about? Or just bragging rights about anything?
Okay, hello.
Oh, are you back?
I think so. Let's try it again. It said that Zoom had to update. Why?
Great.
Why would it say that? Okay.
Just
Yeah.
for fun, just to keep you on your toes.
Hold on. Hold on. Sorry, everybody. This is a
Don't worry
nightmare.
about it. We're not worried.
Okay.
Making noises. Ah, look at you. We
Can you see a
it.
screen? Can
We
you all see a
totally
screen?
can.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, and now can I make it play my slideshow?
Look at
Okay,
you.
okay, sorry about that. I'm really sorry about that. Okay, so I'm gonna give a talk that's a little bit split into two components. So first, I have no disclosures. And this is me, and Bree already introduced me and sort of said what my background is. I'm an internist with fellowships in geriatrics and palliative care from Mount Sinai. In the very end of 2016, I became the first jail-based geriatrician in the country, which is like a sort of depressing honorific, and started seeing patients on Rikers Island. And I'll talk a little bit about how that came to be. While I was on Rikers, I started something called the Geriatrics and Complex Care Service in 2018 and led that until I left. In working with that team, I also led our agency's compassionate release work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And all of that work around compassionate release and court advocacy on behalf of patients prepared me and my team in ways that we clearly didn't anticipate to lead our COVID decarceration efforts when the pandemic hit in 2020. And so we led the COVID decarceration efforts that resulted in the release of 1,500 people from the New York City jail system over 6 weeks. I left that job last winter. I now am a research fellow at the Institute to End Mass Incarceration, which is housed at Harvard Law School. I'm also doing freelance writing. And in 2023, I'm going to start seeing patients again with the city through the safety net clinics in the city's public hospital system. So I said I'm going to sort of talk in two parts. The first part is going to be, I'm going to rush through what I know everybody on this call already knows about the phenomenon of graying of American jails and prisons, but I do want to talk about jails specifically, which tend to get less attention because there just is so much less data than there is for prisons. And then I'm going to offer a hypothesis for why the American justice system is graying, but really focusing on that jail population. And this is very much a work in progress that I'll be sharing with you all. And then that's going to sort of lead into the second half, which is how I sort of came to identify this issue and the clinical work that I did around this issue while I was working on Rikers, which I think is sort of interesting if there are clinicians on the call, but also has policy implications, I think, for folks who are policymakers or interested in that. So briefly summarizing the phenomenon of graying of American jails and prisons, and we start with accelerated aging, a phenomenon you all know, but just to sort of set cutoffs in incarcerated populations, we talk about using 50 or 55 as a cutoff for defining geriatric age rather than 65, which is used in the community. I'm not going to dwell on this because you all know it better than anybody else in the country. And this is a slide that I stole from Bree and I've been using for a decade that shows the unbelievable explosion of older folks who were incarcerated in the US between 1990 and about 2015. That's a phenomenon that very much continued. So while the US prison population peaked in 2008 and then began to sort of level off, and there was a national decarceration phenomenon happening between 2009 and and 2009 and 2019, the number of people over 55 who were incarcerated in state and federal correctional institutions more than doubled. And at the bottom, you can just see that there are some stats from 2015 about which states had the highest proportions of older folks. Locally, so I'm based in Brooklyn and New York City. Locally, the New York State prison system is a really dramatic example of this because it has shrunk really dramatically over the last 15, 20 years. So between 2007 and 2016, the total New York State prison population decreased 17%. Over that same period, the population over 55 increased 46%. Which is just such a dramatic juxtaposition that shows that it was a shrinking system with an increasing proportion of folks, right, who are much older. Certainly not coincidentally, healthcare costs for the state prison system in New York State increased 20% just between 2013 and 2016 alone, driven largely by that older population. The question is, are jails aging too, right? And the reason that this is an incredibly relevant question is both for sort of thinking about jail policy, but also thinking about what's driving this aging phenomenon in prisons. Is it people who are aging in place, which is what folks tend to popularly imagine, or is there also a phenomenon of new admissions of older folks coming into the prison system? It's really, really hard to figure out. So jails seldom report age as part of their census demographics. And so you have to sort of, and they're basically not compiled, like jail statistics are not compiled anywhere in a useful way. So you have to sort of extrapolate from what's available. FBI data indicated that there are, between 2007 and 2014, over 1 million people over 50 were arrested annually. Between 1999 and 2013, admissions to state prisons for people in the sort of core demographic, 18 to 24, of folks who tend to be incarcerated, declined 11%, while admissions for that for people 55 and older increased 308%. So that's really dramatic to me, right? That says that in that period of time, older folks were coming into the system in a new way, not just aging, they hadn't just been arrested in their 20s and were aging in place. New York City, we do have data on. So this is also a very dramatic graph to me. New York City has seen a huge decarceration effort over the last 20 years. This is from 2009 to 2019, and the line that is downsloping is the total census. So over that period of time, the jail population in the city went from around 9 or 10,000 folks to about 7,000, and it continued to drop up until the first COVID decarceration. What you see with the upsloping lines, the white line represents the population 55 and older as a percentage of new admissions to the jail system. And the yellow line represents people 55 and older who are leaving our system and going to the prison system as a percentage of folks getting discharged from the New York City jail system to the New York City prison system. This is really impressive to me because it again suggests that what we're seeing is older folks is a greater proportion of the people who are coming into the system, into the jail system, and who are then getting sentenced to prison. So they're not just coming in as part of the sort of jail churn, jail community, they're also getting sent upstate. Using all of this, when you look at it's sort of, I think the right thing to do is actually to think about the over 55 population or the over 50 population as actually being sort of two subpopulations. For the population that's 65 and older, the growth in prisons does seem to be driven largely by long-timers, so people who are serving multi-decade sentences. In 2013, 50% of people who were 65 and older were serving greater than 10 years, 31% were serving life sentences. But for the population 50 to 60, so who are in the younger group of older folks who are justice involved, the growth looks like it's primarily driven by new admissions, people being admitted to prison after the age of 50. The majority of these folks are not being admitted for the first time. This is not their first arrest. If you look at New York State, and again, as an example of this, New York State has more available data than lots of places. The population over 60 was the only age group that saw an increase in the number of prison admissions year over year between 2015 and 2019. Admissions for all other age groups declined. So there are more older folks coming into our jail system in the city. There are more older folks going upstate. And that's happening as those populations are, the overall system populations are contracting, driven by diversion of people younger than 50 or 60. So it was really notable to me when I started to work at Rikers. Basically what happened is I wrote their CMO when I was finishing fellowship, and I said, I'd love to come work with you, but I just did this whole fellowship in geriatrics and palliative care, and I'd like to use these skills. Do you think you have an aging problem? And he said, I don't know, but maybe. Why don't you come and find out? And so prior to my arrival, they sort of hired a geriatrician on faith, and frankly, because they needed doctors and they were letting people come to find their own jobs. But no one had ever counted the older folks on Rikers Island before this, because in the popular imagination, as you all know, people do not imagine that older folks are justice involved, certainly do not imagine them as being newly arrested for crime. Over the course of the time that I was at Rikers, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, it became clear that actually there was a substantial portion of population of people who are 50 or 55 and older who were jail incarcerated in New York City. And there was a substantial population of folks who were being recurrently jail incarcerated. And I got really interested in this phenomenon and trying to sort of figure out why this would be, and couldn't find a ton about it when in the literature. In the winter of 2022, in the CUNY Law Review, with some colleagues who are criminologists and who did the heavy stats lifting for this paper, we published a paper that sort of tries to hypothesize what was going on here. And we called that paper Elderly, Detained, and Justice Involved, the Most Incarcerated Generation. with the idea that the most incarcerated generation was referring to the folks that I was taking care of, the people who are sort of 50 to 65 or so, and who were justice involved in the US. This is the age crime curve, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It is a sort of a foundational idea in criminology that says that there's a clear relationship between age and likelihood of criminal behavior and arrest. And it's been around for 40 years, and sort of has been validated in multiple real life data sets to suggest that people who become justice involved, people who enter into criminal behavior, tend to do so in their mid-adolescence, around 15. And that then, so you can see this peak in the sort of late adolescence period, and that then likelihood of justice involvement and likelihood of arrest really, decreases as people age. And that most folks age out of crime, right? Which is this very important sort of claim that we make a lot as advocates, right? That people's risk of recidivism decreases as they age, that older folks are much less likely to be recurrently violent, et cetera, et cetera. Learning about the age crime curve was really challenging for me because I was like, well, what about all my guys? Are all my guys, sort of in this tail end of folks am I seeing all these folks who are representing this very slim population of people who are supposed to sort of stay criminal justice involved even past the age of 50? Or actually, is it possible that this relationship has been broken in some ways over the last 15 or 20 years? So in sociology, there are, when you're trying to sort of explain a phenomenon like this, there are different types, sort of buckets of factors that can be used to explain something that, an observation of changing behavior over time like this. So there are aging factors, and aging factors happen across all generations as they age, regardless of time period. So for example, people age out of liking loud concerts. There are period factors, right? So when you're trying to explain a point in time observation, and you're trying to figure out if that's related to the cohort or to the period factors are phenomena related to a time in history that affect all birth cohorts alive at that time. For example, everyone alive in the 1960s had heard of the Beatles. Cohort factors are characteristics or traits or patterns associated with a particular birth cohort. So for example, people who are 11 to 24 when the Beatles were together continue to think they're the best band of all time, is the example that I use. What I was interested in finding out was, is the justice system aging for reasons having to do with period factors or cohort factors? Probably not aging factors, because aging factors don't really make sense because prior generations haven't been as justice involved as the current generation. What our hypothesis suggests, and what sociologists and criminologists who are looking at this have also sort of concluded, is that this is likely a cohort effect related to a period effect. So some Porter et al. Sociologists who did a study that showed that people born around the 1960s, somewhere between 1955 and 1970, who hit adolescence or their 20s in the 1980s during the crack epidemic, during the 80s to 90s crime waves, they, as a birth cohort, as a generation, hit the period of time when there was high likelihood of criminal involvement because they were the right age, at a time when there was a huge crime wave in the country. There is also this really important recent paper by sociologists Neal and Sampson that found that birth year was more predictive of justice involvement than any other known risk factors, including socioeconomic status. So what does this mean? Or what does that look like? So this is from that Neal and Sampson paper. And what it shows is that, so this is the age crime curve, okay? Talking on Zoom is so funny because you can't see people. But let me see if this works. The solid line represents people who were born in 1980. The dotted line is people born in 1985. And the dashed line is people born in 1995. So if you were born in 1980, you were 13 in 1993, which was like the peak of homicides in the country, okay? So and what this shows is that the y-axis is probability of arrest. Model 1 is just showing the probability of arrest sort of without any controlling for anything. And it shows that folks who were born in 1980 were more than twice as likely to be arrested at sort of that peak of arrest likelihood, right? Than folks who were born in 1995 who were 13 in 2008. I'm going to pause for a second. For model number 2, they said, well, how do we think about controlling for other phenomena that increase risk of arrest? So they, I want to undo that. No, stop doing that. Why is it doing that? For model number 2, they plotted the same graph, but they tried to control using some regression or something for individual factors having to do with things like they have this incredible data set where they have all of these surveys that look at people's health histories, look at people's histories of mental health, look at people take this battery of tests that look at things like self-control and aggression set like ratings. So looking at individual factors, looking at neighborhood factors, like violence and gun violence rates in a given neighborhood, and looking at looking at period factors. And even when they were adjusting for those things, what they found was that the same relationship basically held, like the curves look basically the same, right? So in other words, birth year still mattered the most. Does that, okay, see if we'll go forward. The Sampson and Neal paper looks at people born between 1979 and 1995. Obviously, the population that I was taking care of is younger, and the population that Porter's hypothesizing about is also younger. I mean, older. I'm sorry, was born earlier. This graph just shows that if this is the growth of the prison system, right? And if you were born in 1960, then you were 16 in 1976. You were in your mid-20s, let's say in the 80s. They hit adolescence in the 20s as the mass incarceration was taking off, right? So a period factor that they interacted with was not just what was happening on the streets, but also the response to what was happening on the streets, which included the rapid expansion of the use of incarceration and punishment. Justice involvement is the strongest predictor of future justice involvement, and justice involvement during late adolescence really disrupts building foundations for adulthood. So the hypothesis here is that the folks who I was taking care of we're calling them the most incarcerated generation. They're folks who aged into propensity for criminal behavior and arrest at the very wrong time, when mass incarceration was expanding most rapidly, when the system was the most punitive and hungriest, that they were arrested and became justice involved, and that fundamentally disrupted their lives in a way that many of them could not stabilize from on the other side. And they remained justice involved as they aged. This is data from our paper, and it's showing age crime curves for different 5-year periods from 1975 to 2019. The first column are from Missouri. The second column are from New York. The third column are from Pennsylvania. The top row are property crime arrests, and the bottom row are violent crime arrests. And what you can see, so the lowest line here oh, you guys can't see my arrow, I think. The lowest line in all of these graphs is 1975. And then the bolded line is 2019. And what that's showing is that as time goes on, the age crime curve like lifts off the x-axis, showing that there are more older folks getting arrested for both property crimes and violent crimes in all three of these states in recent years versus 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So this summarizes sort of the some of what I just said, which is so basically that the most incarcerated generation, that they've reached their prime or end of prime age for contact with law enforcement when the system was hungriest and most punitive, that they were sentenced during a turn towards longer sentences when 3 strike rules were being implemented, when there was decreased use of clemency compared to prior generations, when there was increased use of life without parole, et cetera. That they arrived in prison for an era when solitary was used, when there was no frills imprisonment, this sort of trend towards a more punitive punishment system. That those who were released starting in the late 1990s came out to the most punitive reentry milieu in history, that they were the first to be surveilled under expanded use of community service and the sex offender registry, and that a proportion of them were not released from long sentences or diverted from new incarcerations in the wave of efforts to decrease mass incarceration's footprint. Oh, sorry. So I read that bullet wrong. So in the wave of efforts to decrease mass incarceration's footprint since 2008, this group of folks has not benefited as much from reforms as younger justice involved populations have. And this is in part because by the time some of those reforms came into being, these folks had accumulated either long rap sheets or they were long-termers who were spending decades in prison and who didn't benefit from those diversion efforts. The other thing is that as they age, they get harder to divert. So there are just, as you all know, there are incredible reentry challenges, right? And these are folks who very much live on an institutional circuit, the patients that I took care of. So they would come into jail on discharge, they might go to the shelter, they would have, significant medical burdens and end up in an emergency room, a hospital, a nursing home, or a rehab. Something would happen, they would end up back in jail, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but our experience, as I'm sure many of you have found, is that none of these places are the right place for this population. Jails are not designed to take care of the old and the sick. And none of these other places are comfortable taking care of justice involved patients as a rule. So this is a generation whose experience has been complicated by state violence and trauma, undertreated substance use issues, which I didn't talk about a ton, but right, these are folks who were in their teens and 20s during the height of the crack epidemic and also the just say no to drugs era, right? Long rap sheets and community surveillance means that they're hard to divert at point of arrest and point of arraignment, who have very much suffered under restrictive parole practices, who, because of sort of decades of justice involvement, may be estranged from communities that could help them stabilize. And now as they age, they have excess medical comorbidities that interact with mental health, substance use issues. So they're not being diverted. They aren't being let go. They can't stabilize in the community with the existing service landscape. I'm going to now sort of flip to the second half of this talk, which is talking about when I met these folks on Rikers Island, who were they and what's the care model that we built for them? So for those of you who don't know, the New York City jail system, or Rikers Island, is a complex of multiple facilities on Rikers Island, which is a real island that is sort of north of Queens, like right beside LaGuardia Airport. In 2022, it had around 18,000 admissions, which is down dramatically from 49,000 admissions in 2018. The current average daily population is 6,000, as you saw in that previous slide. That's down significantly from like 12 years ago. It was at 10 or 11,000. It's a huge system from a employment perspective. So there are 11,000 corrections officers working on Rikers, which is, as you can see, almost 2 per admitted detainee, which is wild, and over 1,000 clinical staff. The agency that I worked for was not the Department of Corrections. One of the really critical things to understand about the New York City jail system is that we have an independent health authority. And that really makes a huge difference. It means that we are not in the same chain of command as the security authority. And because we're not in the same chain of command as the security authority, some of the typical dual loyalty issues that can come up when you do work for the corrections authority are less, there's less tension around some of those things. The agency that I worked for was called Correctional Health Services, and we are a subdivision of Health and Hospitals, which is the New York City public hospital system. We staffed all jails with medical providers 24/7. Every admitted patient had a full medical intake, access to sick call and chronic care follow-up visits. We had a ton of specialty services available on site, including a dialysis suite on the island, labs, x-ray, rotating consultants, like a cardiologist who would come and have a regular clinic on the island. But we also had partnerships for inpatient and additional specialty care with local public hospitals. In most jails, there was minimal continuity with primary care providers. So folks would come in, they'd have their intake. If they needed chronic care follow-up for, say, asthma or hypertension, they might get scheduled for that, but not with the same provider typically. And that has been the standard for decades. The exception to that is the infirmary, which is an almost like nursing home SAR level of care provided in one of the jails for the sickest and most functionally impaired, sort of 120 people in the system. And there is continuity of care. There are personal care attendants, there's a better nursing ratio for nurses to patients, and there's a slightly different dynamic between clinical staff and corrections staff. Overall, it's a large system, even as it's shrinking, with both churn and now a very long length of stay. The average length of stay in 2022 was 120 days. That was up from like 80 days 2 years before. It's become a huge crisis in the COVID era because of court slowdowns, that people come in and just never leave. It is not a system that has been at all designed to accommodate a large population of older or sicker folks. And it's a really complicated system. So it's run by multiple agencies with different jurisdictions. Healthcare, so our agency, does not control patient movement or admission or discharge. Patients and the systems have multiple competing priorities. This is true in correctional health anywhere. And that healthcare and staff is only one of them, right? And as with any correctional facility, patients are separated from social support and surrogate decision makers, which is just a huge issue for older folks or people who have serious illness. So these are some of the challenges. I said that when I got there, no one had ever counted the older folks before. So we said, can we do that? And this is the result of a retrospective chart review that we did that we published in 2022. It took a long time. Looking at the older population, so 50 folks 55 and older in the New York City jail system between 2015 and 2019. And that was published in Health Affairs. And when we tried to characterize this population, we we broke our comparison groups into people who were under 55, people who were 55 to 64, and then people who were 65 and older, in part because I had this experience of, in my clinical care, taking care of what felt like two sort of distinct populations, the guys who were in their like sort of mid 50s versus the folks who were really in this oldest old group. What we found was between 2015 and 2019, the population 55 and older represented 8.5% of the total census on Rikers Island, which is significant and much bigger than anyone would have guessed, I think, before we did this. The majority were in that 55 to 64-year-old group. And that 55 to 64-year-old group, in terms of demographics, had the highest likelihood compared to the other two groups of being non-Hispanic, Black, homeless, and on Medicaid. We really think this is the most incarcerated generation population. This is not going to surprise any of you who know this, but older patients in the New York City jail system, much more medically complex than younger patients, more likely to be seriously mentally ill, not just seriously medically ill, more likely to have gait impairment or a disability, more likely to have a substance use disorder. And the 55 to 64-year-old group specifically was most likely to have polysubstance use disorders. They were much more likely to die in custody. They took more medications, obviously, and they used more hospital services and emergency room services than younger patients. Again, I think you all probably know this, but just to think about sort of some of the perils of jail incarceration for such a vulnerable group, we can, and this is also a shout out to Bree, who said, you know, you can really extrapolate from who taught me that you can really extrapolate from some of the institutionalization effects data about what we know about what happens to older folks who get hospitalized or go to nursing homes or assisted livings to think about what institutionalization in a jail or a prison might mean for someone. And I'm going to talk about a case that illustrates this. Similarly, you can think about geriatric syndromes. So folks who are older, right, have these multifactorial syndromes where for a variety of reasons, they're prone to functional decline, falls, increased sensory impairment, cognitive impairment, et cetera. And this is just a slide that's showing some of the jail-specific factors that accelerated or exacerbated geriatric syndromes that were present in my patient population. So for example, when I first got to Rikers, I realized that my older patients with gait impairment were being rear cuffed, as in they were being handcuffed with their hands behind them when they were being taken to court, which meant that if they fell, they had no way to protect themselves, right? Like they were just going to fall on their face. And that was happening. People were shuffling along with their feet cuffed and their hands cuffed behind them in a way that felt incredibly dangerous. And there were all of these sort of really obvious risk factors in the environment or in the conventions of the culture, right, that just hadn't sort of come to notice, in part because, again, this geriatric population and its needs were sort of invisible, even though it was also very prevalent. So when I first got to Rikers, I spent a year just seeing patients as a consultant. I tried to meet everybody in the system who was 60 and older. And then if I could, I would meet people younger if they were referred to me for an issue. And it became really apparent that this was a population that was dramatically underserved by existing services. And that specifically was being underserved in the area of discharge planning, reentry services, and court advocacy, and that there needed to be a different way of sort of identifying these very high-risk patients and helping keep them safe and helping make sure that they had a safe reentry if they were going back to the community. So in 2018, we started something called the Geriatrics and Complex Care Service, which was an interdisciplinary team of clinicians, social workers, court liaisons, and reentry coordinators, most of whom had lived experience in the New York City jail system, who aimed as a team to improve outcomes for older and medically complex patients. And this is a great example of sort of why working for this public agency at this time in the history of New York City's jail system was just an unbelievable opportunity and gift, because when I proposed doing this, they said, okay, sure. And they let me hire all these people and supported that work. And that was obviously just an unbelievably lucky opportunity to build something that had never been tried before. We took care of about 175 to 200 oldest and sickest patients in the jail system at a given time. And we provided a variety of services for those folks. We had embedded specialized clinical care in buildings with large cohorts of older patients. So we had a nurse and a nurse practitioner who would see people regularly in places where the oldest people were most likely to be housed. Additionally, I would see patients for clinical consultations who had serious illness or complicated geriatric palliative care issues. I did a lot of care coordination, sort of clinical medical directing between the jails and the hospital system. The jail system tends to feel, I think, to providers in the community like something of a black box. It's hard for them to sort of understand how care is delivered. It's hard for them to feel confident that their discharge plans are going to be carried out. We really worked very hard on building relationships to improve those transitions. We did a lot of court liaison and health-based legal advocacy, and I'll talk about that towards the end. And we did a lot of reentry planning for folks. So I wanted to share a patient story to illustrate some of this, both the challenges and the complexities and the limitations of what we could do, and also the ways that I think we did make a difference for people. I took care, this is a real story. I took care of a guy who we'll call HG, who was admitted in 2017. He was 84 at the time of admission. So this is not one of my most incarcerated generation folks. This is a guy who was a little bit older, but who had been recurrently arrested and incarcerated throughout his life. He, at the time of admission, was short of breath when he walked more than 25 feet, and he walked with a cane. While he was in jail, he had functional decline because he basically didn't move around very much, and ended up in a wheelchair. Whenever he was going to leave his dorm, he would sort of like use his cane around his dorm, but if he was going to go any further, he required a wheelchair. He seemed to have some cognitive impairment, but it was very, very hard to assess a baseline for him. That was a persistent challenge with working with the older population in jail, that you don't know what people's baseline is really like, and you're meeting them in this really complicated setting where they're under a huge amount of stress, and there are all of these confounding sort of stressors. They're making it really hard to assess what's going on for them. He was on greater than 10 medications. And he was a guy who just didn't want a lot of medical care. He didn't trust the system very much. He was refusing all specialty services and Bellevue visits for lots of reasons, in part because the trip to the hospital and sitting in the pens, which were like the cages basically where people are held while they're awaiting specialty services at the hospital, was too uncomfortable for him. Prior to his arrest, he had been renting a room independently in the community. He had lost it and he was now homeless. He would be homeless if he was going to be discharged back to the community. The wheelchair and the shortness of breath, the worsening shortness of breath, created new needs on discharge also, that meant that he needed a different setting in terms of accessibility on care when he left compared to when he came in. This question about cognitive impairment and whether it was worse than when he came in or not also potentially pretended something about function on discharge that would make it hard to sort of know what he would really need when he went to the community. And his Medicaid and his SSI were suspended, as they are for everybody who gets incarcerated. So this was a guy very typical for us. We were incredibly worried about him while he was in, but we were also incredibly worried about what would happen to him when he left. I showed this visualization before of the institutionalization circuit. He is a guy who had very much gone around this cycle multiple times. And typical of my other patients as well, his experience had been that it had totally failed him. So institutionalization was bad for him, but also all of the entities through which he had passed had not been equipped to accommodate geriatric justice involved patients. While he was incarcerated on Rikers, he was admitted to our infirmary. With our team, he saw me regularly and also our NP regularly, and we did form a really tight bond with him, and he did begin to accept services that he had not previously accepted and to take his medications. We referred him to nursing homes, assisted livings, and supportive housing programs in the community in anticipation of potential discharge. He was denied from all. This was our typical experience. We were constantly completing the paperwork to refer folks, and then they just wouldn't get in. It was very, very challenging to get someone in, especially to an assisted living or a nursing home facility from jail directly. They basically would only accept someone if they were like bedbound and sort of on hospice. We provided a letter about his medical needs to his attorney, who in turn passed it on to the court, to the judge, in the hopes of influencing a decision about whether he really should be jail remanded or not. And then we thought constantly about what his plan B would be. So what would happen if he was discharged to a shelter? What would we do for him? What could we put in place for him on a moment's notice, right? One of the really critical distinctions between jails and prisons is that you don't control when people come in, you don't control when people leave. And so we couldn't anticipate when he was going to go home. It could happen at a moment's notice. And then we wouldn't have a lot of time to sort of catch up with him. And that's basically what happened. So he got acquitted at trial after over a year in jail. Apparently, the jury stood up and clapped for him because they had been so charmed by him during his trial. It was a Wednesday in like November, and it was dark and cold and 5 p.m. And his attorneys called us in a panic and said, oh my God, he won his case and they want to send him home. And what happens in that circumstance is that a person is released basically directly from court. So they don't even have their things from jail. They're supposed to then retrieve them later. And so this is where we put our plan B in motion. And this is, I think, again, a good example of sort of both a couple of things. One, the sort of intensity of creative work required to make a difference in these cases. Two, the constraints that mean that you're not going to really do a ton, honestly, to change the circumstances of this because you don't control the community safety net that's waiting for him. But three, that you can make a difference if you have a pre-existing relationship with the patient and you know what his needs are, and you have the relationships within your own system to sort of to try to figure out new pathways. So we talked to him, and he was terrified. He didn't want to leave from court. He said, I want to come back and get my meds. I don't know what to do. We negotiated with the court and with the corrections department to put him on a special hold so that he would come back to the jail overnight. He would be able to get his coat. He would be able to get his papers, etc. And then he would leave first thing in the morning. Then we met him first thing in the morning at the jail. We had meds in hand for him. We provided transportation to a shelter with accompaniment so that somebody would walk him in and make sure that he was handed off to a shelter intake person who would understand his situation. We fought with the Department of Corrections to make sure that they gave him both a wheelchair and a cane because he was using both. And we gave him our phone number so that he could call us. And once he was established, and we began making referrals to community health worker organizations to get him hooked up with someone in the community. And we stayed in touch with him for a couple of weeks. We expedited getting his Medicaid turned back on. We got him medical follow-up appointments at Bellevue within 2 weeks of discharge, and called to remind him to go. This is him. So, and this is used not just with his blessing, but he's very dapper. But he had actually come with me once to give this talk, and was very eager to sort of share his experience, because I ran into him 4 months later at the hospital. And at that time, he was living in the shelter system, and he told me that it was much scarier than it had been the last time he had been in the shelter system, and he didn't feel safe. He was on limited monthly income from SSI and using food pantries. He was in medical care and going to his appointments at Bellevue and taking his medications, and he felt much better than he did 6 months ago. So from a functional standpoint, you can see he's standing here. He was just using his cane. He wasn't using his wheelchair anymore because he was moving around much more than he had been, and he had regained some of his functional capacity. But he was really anxious, and he said, I don't know what's going to happen to me. And so he had spent a year plus in jail for no reason at all, right? He was ultimately acquitted of the thing that he was accused of, which is just really appalling to think about. And over that time, he had seemed to have sort of this very serious decline, where it was very unclear what would happen to him on discharge. He lost all of his sort of resources that he'd had prior to arrest. And at the same time, he actually seemed better post-discharge than he did when he was in, which was really this incredibly important reminder to me that when I met people in jail, it was very hard to predict what they would look like in the community 3 months after they left us, right? That like people would come in, that I was meeting people often at a very low point for them when they might look worse than they were going to on discharge, that they wouldn't necessarily stay the way that I sort of saw them when they were back, especially if they were going home to folks who they knew and to a setting that they were comfortable with.
Rachel, we are loving this. I just time check.
3
We're like
minutes.
really right at the end. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So you guys, so whatever, we're gonna skip this slide. You guys know that people in jails and prisons are theoretically entitled to a community standard of healthcare, but that this is very complicated in the US and that it's really difficult. And I would say sort of impossible in jails, at least, to deliver community standard geriatric and palliative care. Especially palliative care, I found very, very difficult. My approach changed dramatically over the time that I was there, from trying to sort of mimic what I had done in the community with folks to totally changing my practice, because what happens in jail, like people are just totally separated from, you can see from this list, from their families. There are all of these barriers to being able to deliver what we're taught in the community is sort of what we want to give people at end of life. And so we used compassionate release incredibly aggressively. This is a slide just summarizing how compassionate release works in prisons versus in jails. In prisons, it's a loose term for any program that allows people to be released prior to the completion of their minimum sentence based on medical needs. And it's usually a very defined process where there is a medical assessment and then there's an assessment by a parole board about whether the person's going to be released. It tends to be underused. You all know all of this as well. In jails, there's no sort of similar pathway, right, that's defined, because jails have a mix of patients who are pre-conviction, convicted but awaiting sentencing, on parole, or already sentenced. And so what we called compassionate release was really these one-off negotiations with the folks who are holding our patients in. And that required me learning a lot about the legal system, and then these sort of really creative, like one-on-one solutions for folks. Prior to my arrival, physicians on Rikers had been advocating on behalf of seriously ill patients for decades, but our team was much more proactive about doing it, and frankly, much more aggressive about doing it for patients in greater numbers. This was our criteria. So we used 2 different buckets. Compassionate release eligibility were the folks who we were making a strong statement to the court advocating for someone's urgent release. Those were folks who we thought had imminent chance of dying while incarcerated. What we called health-based legal advocacy is what we offered everyone else who we thought was sort of seriously ill and not being well served by their incarceration, but who had a prognosis that was less certain to us. I will, in the interest of time, not go through this, but this is an excerpt of the type of letter that I would write on behalf of patients to the courts. You can see, if you scan it, that it was, again, this is a Bree Williams special, extremely strongly worded, but also as much as possible, I tried to communicate clearly and in lay people language about what was going on with someone. So not just saying what their prognosis was, but trying to give a sense of what trajectory of illness would be like, so that prosecutors could understand and could picture what it would look like for this person to be going through stage 4 cancer while they were incarcerated. We did 120 compassionate release cases between 2017 and February of 2020. That's a lot, and it felt very good. But what we didn't know was that doing that was really setting us up for the first wave of COVID when we led the decarceration, because we understood how to sort of work with the legal system from a medical perspective, provide them with the information that they needed. 1,500 people were released over 6 weeks between March and May of 2020. It was incredibly dramatic. And the jail population reached its nadir of 3,800 at the end of April. What this is showing is that by November, it was already starting to go back up. This is November of 2020. We preferentially decarcerated older folks in that wave, right? Because we were advocating for the people who we thought were at highest risk of serious illness with COVID. But by 2 years later, that population had also started to increase again as well. And this is after I left, but I wrote this piece that was in the New Yorker about basically why this experience had catalyzed my leaving, in part because we had made all of this progress that felt so hard won and exciting. And then that progress really backslid, as it has in cities around the country, as attitudes towards criminal justice reform changed in New York City. So, summary, jails are aging, driven by recurrent incarceration of older adults who can't escape histories of justice involvement. We're calling this the most incarcerated generation. They're terrible places for elderly people to spend significant amounts of time, but harm reduction regarding geriatric risks is possible with dedicated resources. Although it's truly harm reduction, it's not trying to achieve standard of care. And so diversion or fast release is preferable and doable with, again, I think, dedicated resources and expertise. And that's it for now. And sorry that I went right up to the last minute. And thank you especially to Bree, who taught me everything. And
well, that is not true. Rachel taught me most of what I know. But anyway, thank you for that. That was an incredible presentation. We have, as evidenced by the fact that like the vast majority of people stayed past. We have a little bit of time, I think, if people are still here, especially because we had 2 hours and we have or an hour and a half, we had a works in progress planned. So if anybody wants to ask some questions, we would be happy to hear a little bit. You also have some healthcare professionals from, Allison Paczynski is the medical director at San Quentin, who, you have a lot of researchers on this call who've been doing work like you, Mark Fenig, who runs the Medical Justice
Hi, Mark.
Alliance. So lots of different people doing lots of different things, really loving this presentation. And Elise, if you don't mind, if we just spend a couple minutes and see if there's a couple questions, then it would be great to take that opportunity. So raise your hand if you have questions. Or just run, yeah, or just
will you call on people, because I can't
or
see
just yell out. One question is whether we can get a PDF of your New Yorker article and send it around. Is that something that you can send to us and I'll send out?
Yes.
I'll just send it to the people on this thing. So, and I'll do it personally. So it'll not seem like we're copyright violating. That would be fantastic. Justin.
Hi, Justin.
Rachel. Hey, great to see you. Thank you for the talk. Very impressive as always. And you're very inspiring of all the work that you've done and put forth. I'm curious if in your process, especially with the compassionate release, your mention of Mr. HG, how many people community resources were not open to accepting them. And if you or anyone on the team had insights into trying to expand community resources for people coming out of prison. That's been a major challenge for us, where the courts will even say a person could be paroled if someone were willing to take them, but they don't.
Yeah. So basically what we found was that what would happen is somebody would get arrested, they would get brought in, they would have been living totally on the margins in the community prior to arrest, in the shelters, falling through the cracks, totally like surviving by their wits. They would get arrested, they would come in, and the courts would look at them and say, oh, well, now we can't release them to that same circumstance. Now we have to put them in a place that we think seems safe for them. And my experience was that the courts preferred more restrictive institutional settings whenever possible. They were the most satisfied with a plan that was going to put someone in like a locked dementia unit. And like any sort of level of restriction less than that was more uncomfortable for them. But exactly as you're saying, and our experience was that we very seldom could get people into those types of settings. There are very few beds for those folks, you know, even for people from the community who need those kinds of resources in New York. So I didn't even mention this, but we had this idea while I was there that is being enacted by the city for something called Just Home. And Just Home is supposed to be a supportive housing complex that the city is going to build. This is a complicated thing. I can explain how it came to be. That's going to have, I think, 50 beds for justice involved folks who have complex medical needs. And the idea is that this is not supposed to be transitional housing. This is supposed to be a place where somebody can be paroled or come home from jail too, and then stay, where there will be on-site services that are supposed to match the actual needs of this population. So not only like a nurse on site, but substance use services on site, mental health providers on site, et cetera, programming on site. And it's going to be a partnership between the city and the Fortune Society, which is a huge criminal justice organization in New York. That model is incredible. And if it comes to be, it is going to be a critical model, I think, for the whole country, for one way of sort of how to divert this very high needs population. There is also, of course, the Connecticut model of having a state-owned nursing home, right, for folks who are coming out of prison. New York doesn't have that, but absolutely should have that. New York does have 2 locked dementia units in its correctional system, which is outrageous, right? You could just put all those folks in the community, and among other things, then Medicare and Medicaid would kick in for them. So my feeling is that you really do have to be very thoughtful about not just trying to get existing infrastructure to accommodate these patients with sort of the wrong, like a bad match of services, but that you do have to build stuff in the community that recognizes that it's a growing population. They're not going away, and you need to meet their needs.
Thank you.
I had a question. Hi, I'm Julie Lifshay. I'm a senior program manager with Amend.
Hi.
Hi, that was an incredible presentation. I learned so much and really appreciate your work. You may have mentioned this, or it might also be in your paper, but I just wondered if you had looked at the role that race played in this most incarcerated population generation.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at it. Rob Sampson is looking at race as a intersecting factor with this question of whether what he calls the birth lottery of history. So this question about your birth year being a huge determinant of your justice involvement likelihood. And I think there is a paper coming out from him that is trying to sort of pick apart all of the other risk factors for incarceration and justice involvement, and thinking about race. Now, certainly our patient population was disproportionately African-American, in my retrospective study that was in Health Affairs, especially that 55 to 65-year-old group. I have to say that although I use Mr. HG as my example, the 65 and older group is a kind of different beast. The people who come into jail who are 65 and older, some of them are the olds of this generation, but certainly the ones who are coming in at like 70s, 80s, 90s. And I sometimes had people come in at first arrest in their like 80s or 90s. That's a different beast. That's like dementia presenting as arrest or other situations like that. So the short answer is no. And the longer answer is disproportionately Black for sure, but I don't know to what proportion.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So I'll just say that if it's okay with you, and Jelena Arias here, sorry. I know that we're running tight on time, so I'd love to email you, Rachel, and talk a little bit more about what you were just referencing as far as dementia presenting as arrest. That's kind of the area that I've been working on from the legal side, doing interviews with legal stakeholders and thinking a lot about some of the placement issues that you've mentioned, as well as like the dementia detection issues and the lack of data in the jail. So I think Bree told me like 2 years ago that I should connect with you, and I just haven't. So I will be reaching out to you if that's okay.
Great. Yes, absolutely. Anybody should who has follow-up questions we don't get to, because I do know that I push the time.
Wonderful. I think Lindsay had one last question. She asked about sort of the the degree to which the aging of the overall population account for what you're seeing with the growing older demographic in jails and prisons, and then maybe we can stop there.
So the answer is that although the population I'm taking care of is like part of the baby boom, probably it's not because of the baby boom. So it's not just attributable to the overall aging of the population. It's disproportionate, significantly disproportionate.
Great. Well, thank you again, Rachel. You're welcome to stay for the works in progress with Elise Wursel, but we also understand if you're have to run off to your other things. We're thrilled to have you continue to be part of the Arch Network, and we hope to continue seeing you here. And I'm really grateful that you'll allow us to send out a targeted New Yorker article, which I've already received in my inbox from Kelsey. And so I'll just take responsibility for sending that out so you don't have to give approval. And then if people can send follow-up questions to you or mentorship questions to you, we would be really delighted.
Thank you. There is a kid yelling at me from the other side of the door in the hallway, so I'm going to go attend to that. But thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for all of your important work in this area. Thank you, Bree.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Great. Take care. So we will take a few minute stretch and then we'll go into our works in progress. This is an opportunity for all of us to provide peer mentorship to each other around kind of cross-cutting issues and research in progress related to aging, serious illness, and criminal legal system involvement. Elise Wursel is going to be presenting some of her work. How about everybody take like a 5-minute stretch and come back? You're welcome to stay here and talk a little bit, but I, for one, I'm going to go and grab a cup of water. So I'll be back in a moment. And as a reminder, I think just because it's easier to do so, we still record, but we don't post works in progress videos. So try to stop recording, but if there's a chance that we're going to hang up the whole Zoom call by mistake, then we will continue recording, but we throw it out.